Our text this morning is a very powerful one, I believe. A new command I give you, said Jesus. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. Some years ago, the FACT churches decided to put on a training course, and various ministers took different aspects to lead folk in, looking at the New Testament, looking at the Old Testament, looking at great Christian heroes, and the lot fell upon me to do a course on church history. I did church history when I was studying for the ministry at Spurgeon's College, and really loved it, which was quite strange because I'd never really liked history before, but I began really to get into it. But I pulled out some of my notes, but I thought I need something fresh. And one of the books that I got that I've really found very, very helpful was a book by an American author, Bruce L. Shelley, and it was entitled Church History in Plain Language. I think it was that last little bit that won the book over to me. Put things simply, please. And in the book, at the early part of looking at church history, he was answering the question, how did the church in those early days just explode upon the earth? It kind of took over everything. How did that happen? Well, of course, the immediate answer is God did it. But God was working through people. And so he asks, what were the human factors that contributed to the spread of the gospel? He said one thing was a burning conviction. They really believed in Jesus. They really believed in his death and resurrection. That was the way to find salvation. Second thing was that the Christian gospel met a felt need within the world of the day. People were looking for, what God do you serve? Tell me about your God. Is your God better than my God? So the Christian message addressed a felt need. But here's the very interesting thing that he comments. The church showed a practical expression of love that was probably among the most powerful causes of Christian success. A little while into the 2nd century, there was a man, Tertullian. He was born in 150 AD in Carthage in North Africa, and he became one of what church historians call the apologists. That does not mean to say he went round apologizing to the church, though sometimes we do need to apologize for the way that we live, but rather that word apologist means defense, as in a court of law. You would have the defense and you would have the prosecution. Tertullian was defending the faith. As certain criticisms were made about it, or as things were commented negatively, he would address that, both in speaking and in books. One of the things that are attributed to Tertullian is his comment on society, or the comment of society, I should say. This is what society was saying as they were looking at the church. See how these Christians love one another. And it spoke to the world. Well, isn't that what Jesus said would happen? A new command I give you. You love one another as I have loved you. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples. So it seems to me that love is the hallmark of the church. It shows its genuineness, that we are truly disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. They were open as a new group of people, the Christian church. Whatever social status you had, you're welcome. Come on in. God loves you. Whatever race you are, you're welcome. Come on in. We love you. Whatever color you are, whatever faith background you have, come on in. Whatever gender you are, all are included. All are welcomed. We maybe need to ask the question, is that still the comment today of the church? That we love one another. I suppose it's true to say it's not really a new command, is it? Way back in the Old Testament, in the books of Moses, God said you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your body, and your neighbor as yourself. So love has always been a command of God to his people. But here it comes with renewed emphasis and with a new ability. As I have loved you. We are to love all people, but I believe we are especially to love the people of God. How many of you have heard this saying before? To live above with saints I love, oh, that will be glory. But to live below with saints I know, that's another story. If you laugh, you've probably not heard that. It's true though, isn't it? Christians are always falling out with one another. People are often saying to a church leader, I don't come in here anymore. That person in the church, I don't know how you let them in. And we fall out with one another. Christ's command is that we love one another as I have loved you. Now, this all takes place at the Last Supper. And our reading began when he had left, when he was gone. That he is Judas. Judas leaves the meal, and John, who writes our gospel, knows why. Jesus had said to them, one of you is going to betray me. And that caused them all to turn to one another and ask the question, who is it? Surely not me. And Peter saw that John was leaning against Jesus' breast. And so Peter just motions to John, ask him who it is. And Jesus says to John, I'm going to assume it's in a relatively quiet voice, the one whom I dip the bread and offer the bread to, he's the one. And immediately Jesus dips the bread and he offers it to Judas. And Judas takes it and he eats it. And then Jesus says to him, what you have to do, go and do quickly. And Judas gets up and he leaves the meal. And suddenly John's mind is open to the fact that Judas is the betrayer. That the scripture tells us none of the other disciples knew. So they couldn't have heard what John heard from Jesus. As Judas goes out, it's like darkness falls, for now is set in place all that is needed for the crucifixion of Jesus. And yet, Jesus then says, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. I never cease to marvel at rainbows. But rainbows always appear, don't they, when there's darkness over on this side and a storm. But over on this side, the light is just beginning to come back again. And then you see the glory of that light as the rainbow arches across the sky. Jesus knows the darkness is coming in. But then he says, now the Son of Man is glorified. In this darkest of times, you will now see the glory of God. As Christ is crucified, his glory is revealed. So John knows something that the other disciples don't at this point in time. Jesus now begins to talk about his departure. And he says to them an interesting little phrase, my little children, I'll only be with you a little while longer. Where I'm going, you cannot come. So just if you read on a little bit, he adds, you cannot come now. You will come later, but not now. And that little phrase, my little children, is unique to John's gospel. None of the other gospels use that precise word, but it burnt into John's mind and his memory. For when John writes his letters at the end, in 1 John, he mentions it no less than 9 times. In chapter 2, verse 1, verse 12, verse 13, verse 18, verse 28, he uses that little phrase, my little children. In chapter 3, verse 7 and verse 18, he uses it again. In chapter 4, verse 4, he uses it again. My little children. They're struggling with the world in which they live and all the dark things that are happening. He writes to encourage them and to lift. So he keeps saying what he heard Jesus say. My little children. We're wondering how we ought to live. Let me remind you of what Jesus said. And he goes back to this meal, to these words of Jesus. A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. I find that really difficult to match up to love people as Jesus loved. To love people, okay, to work at that, but to love people as Jesus loved. That's asking a lot. There are 2 examples of how Jesus loved right here in this part of John's Gospel. The first is the washing of the disciples' feet. And in that we see a symbolic cleansing. Peter makes a mistake of saying, well, you can't do that. No. You're taking the part of a servant. And that's the other aspect of it. It's not just symbolic of cleansing. Jesus is showing that he has a total servant heart towards those who are my little children. Whatever you need, if I can do it for you, I will do it. Peter, once he is rebuked by Jesus, says, well, don't only wash my feet, wash all of me. And I think a little touch of humor, Jesus says, you've had a bath. You just need your feet cleansing, Peter. It's symbolic of cleansing, but it shows that Jesus loves to the uttermost, right to the end. He will do anything for those who are his children. Surely the other example of Christ's love, Jesus' love, is his death upon the cross. Paul says in Romans chapter 5 and in verse 8, but God, demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. God's love for us, Jesus' love for us. And this was so much on the heart and mind of John. Let me take you back again to 1 John, as he is writing to the early church that are struggling with all kinds of problems. When John understood that it was Judas Iscariot who was going to betray, and Judas leaves the room, the crucifixion is set in place. John's mind is now changed forever. The command to love. It seems it's all he can think about. Behold, I am not writing a new commandment to you, but an old commandment, which you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard. On the other hand, I am writing a new commandment to you, which is true to him and in you, because the darkness is passing away, and the true light is already shining. The one who says he is in the light and yet hates his brother is in the darkness until now. The one who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling in him. Love his brother. Again, in chapter 3, verse 11, 1 John 3:11. For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Verse 14, we know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. Verse 16, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us. He's not finished yet. In chapter 4 and verse 7, beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And then in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has beheld God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. Can you see how that made such an impact upon John? While Jesus is away, he's no longer with us. What does he want us to do? And the first and most critical thing within the church is that we love one another. We may differ on certain theologies, we may differ on certain things, but deep down, we love one another. We will even wash one another's feet. We will forgive anything. We will love one another. Wow, that's a big thing to ask. And I wonder if what often we do is try to imitate. The whole thing of imitation. I always admire watching on television people who can imitate other people. But I've noticed how so often they do it. They introduce who they're just going to do. So you kind of get them. This is what Bill Clinton would say about this, and then they go into being Bill Clinton. And I always think it's a shame that they have to introduce who they're doing. It's not that good that they trust. Well, I'm not going to do anybody that you know. So I'm on safe ground, but I'm just going to do John for you. Not John, the gospel writer, but John, who was the coach driver when Sue and I were up on holiday in Scotland. If you go to the island of Mull on the ferry, you'll probably pick up a coach to go on what is their A1. When I say A1, it's a single track road that takes you for an hour and a bit to the other side of the island, where you can catch another small boat, perhaps to go over to the island of Staffa or something like that. John was our coach driver, and when he got everybody on the coach, he started up, and he had a little microphone around here. So as he was driving along, he could talk to us and say, I just want you a little to the right. You can see those birds out in the sky. It's lovely birds there. They're unique to the island of Mull. Aye, it's very good. If you've had a whiskey or two, you might see two of them. And he would mutter like that all of the time in his rich Scottish accent. I'm just going to pull over to the left here on this road, because if you see up there, there's two guys up there. They're having a wee bit of an argument about who's going to park. Because on this road, there are little passing stations, you see. And I'm going to have a fight in a minute. Just watch out. Us Scots love to have a fight, you know. And he'd go on like this constantly for an hour and a half on this journey. And when we got back into our car, I started saying to Sue, I'll give you a little running commentary. And I did John. Now, Sue, you don't know that this is good, what I'm doing now, because you don't know John. Sue knows John. And she'll tell you if you want to come and ask. That's brilliant. That's a real good imitation of John. Is that what I'm meant to do about Jesus? To get to know Jesus and simply to copy him. Friends, even if that's what it is, that's a hard task. To copy Jesus. I don't mean speak how he spoke. I mean to live like he lived. And I don't think it's actually about imitation. I think actually what it's about is participation. That's why I wanted to put the vine up there. Because Jesus said in John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me. Let my life just simply flow through you. Grapes don't hang upon a vine trying to be a grape. They are a grape. And it's the most natural thing for them to be a grape. Now, I have to work at imitating John. And in a sense, I have to try and work at being like Jesus. But it's not about me. It's about letting Jesus live in me. There's one person, if he was standing right here beside me, you would think, wow, aren't they alike? And that's my brother Keith. Keith is just like me. I say it because it's really that way round. He's the older and I'm the younger, but he's like me. I'm like him. And so our brother Alan, the eldest, all of us are just like one another. Do you know why? Well, we've lived all our life together, that's one thing, but we all have the same father. Our dad is the same. This may blow your mind. My dad is just the same. Lots of people have said to me over the years here in Frinton, because Dad lived here for quite a number of years, worshipping at the Free Church. Wow, you're just like your dad, aren't you? I have never once tried to imitate Keith. I've never once tried to be like Alan. I've never once tried to be like my dad. I am because that's the way I'm born. And the wonderful news is if we are born of God, the most natural thing to us is to love one another. When we say, I hate that person who comes to the church, I think I'm going to leave. John is saying that person doesn't live in the light. They are still in the darkness. God's love. Let it flow through you. Isn't that what John has just said to us? No one has beheld God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. Do you love me? Will you forgive me for going over time? Amen.